Adelaide, here we are. Thank you so much for coming. We've been in Australia now for, and New Zealand. It's been a couple of weeks with no winter. It's been good. So George's going to come out here, give you a lecture. He's going to lecture from Beyond Order. And after that, we're going to sit here and answer some of the questions that you submitted on Slido. I'll choose some and we'll go through a couple, if he gives us time. But in the meantime, I'm just going to tell you one little story, if you will allow me. I'm going to take a rule. Rule number 9, if old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. I'm just going to tell you a little story about how that chapter has been working in my life lately. So we started renovating our house just before the pandemic. We finished renovating the house really just before the pandemic shut down, but Jordan and I were both very ill, so we weren't really at home much for the renovation, but we hired good contractors and they finished the job, thank goodness. Once we were back in the house, it was only, I think, maybe just before we went to Europe, so a couple of months ago, Dr. Peterson wanted to put the paintings back up on the wall. Now, I had taken all the paintings off the wall and stored them and renovated the house, and he never wanted that to happen, so there was a bit of frustration in the house around that ever since I renovated the house. And we had no paintings on the wall. So we had finally, this one night, negotiated which paintings would go up. And I didn't want any more Soviet paintings on the wall. I'd had them for 20 years, and they'd done whatever damage they were going to do. And we had lots of other paintings, nice paintings, and I thought we could put them up and it would be a much more peaceful place. And he agreed. After we'd been through all this illness, I think we both needed just a calmer place to be. And so we walked through the house and we put some paintings in places where we thought they might go. But it was late at night and we went to bed. And in the morning I got up and I did a Pilates class on Zoom on the 3rd floor. And when I finished, I came downstairs and Dr. Peterson wasn't there, so I called him. He was walking the dog with my son, who you just saw up there. He used to live near us and they were walking the dog. And I said, well, the art installers were supposed to be there in half an hour. And so in not very much time, I saw him come home, but he didn't come in the house. He walked between the houses. They both walked between the houses into the backyard to play ping pong. And I was standing in the dining room waiting for the installers to arrive. And when they walked by the house, I felt this terrible rage just fill my body. And I sat down and I paused and I asked what was going on, because I knew that I wasn't where I thought I was, and what was happening I didn't understand. And I hoped that if I just sat down quietly and asked, I might figure it out. And a memory came to me, an old memory from when I was a teenager. When I was the 4th kid. I was at home with my parents alone from the time I was 12, and we lived up in the north, in this very small community. And my parents, by the time I came along, they were pretty happy to be out doing their own thing. And they curled and went to bonspiels in the winter, and they golfed and went to golf tournaments in the summer. And I had part of that. I used to curl with my mum on Thursday nights, and I used to curl with my mum and dad in the mixed league once a week. And so there was some family time in that, but once I was 12, 13, they were gone most weekends in the winter and the summer. And I can remember one night, they had left on Friday night for a golf tournament, and it was Sunday night, and they hadn't come home. They had driven, right? And my dad was a pretty good partier, so he could have been drinking. And so I think that probably was on my mind that it was a possibility that they'd had an accident because of that, or he'd fallen asleep, who knows. Anyway, I can remember being out on the street corner at 11 or 12 at night and crying, waiting for them, looking down the road, waiting for them, and I thought, wow, that's an old memory. The memory made me cry. And I called Dr. Peterson in the house and I told him about this memory. And I told him that it made me cry. And that was something I realized was I had suffered from a little bit of abandonment, and I didn't know that I had suffered from abandonment. There was a part of my personality that was stuck back there from that time, from that moment, and I'd never updated it. But I wasn't aware that I was suffering from abandonment. And I'd felt this rage one other time too, but I didn't realize, I never got the memory. But this time I got the memory. And that was really good because, first of all, I think that now that I know that, I'm not going to respond in that same way, because I know that that was from a time long ago, and that isn't my life now. There isn't any abandonment going on, and hasn't for a very long time. And even my perception of what is abandonment now to what I was perceiving when I was 12 or 13 years old is very different. And so I realized that if you anything that you get an emotional feeling from that is out of proportion to the event, you have to investigate. And to investigate it is you have to kind of take a step away from yourself, because when you have that kind of emotional engagement in your body, it just grips, so it's not easy to take an objective view of it. But if you can get away from it a little bit and just sit down and not react and ask, if you practice that, you'll eventually get an answer, and you'll understand more what your motivations are. And then you can, if you have the faith, and if you don't have the faith, you can pray to have the faith to step beyond what should and must die, and and let this wiser personality emerge. It's I think it's good for our health, and a good practice. We don't need to be carrying baggage. I don't think baggage is good for anybody. So that's my story. If old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. And with that, please welcome with me Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, particularly to the gentleman in the first row, 2 gentlemen who stood up. It's very nice of you. It's very good of all of you to come tonight. It's always amazing to me to see, well, anyone, really, to come and partake in these serious discussions, but to see so many people, it's really quite endlessly remarkable and rather difficult to account for, but also continually good. And so tonight I'm going to talk about something I've been writing about more. I have a new book coming out in May, I'm hoping. It's called We Who Wrestle with God, which I really like that title. And I found out in 2017, I did a series of lectures on Genesis, and I found out that after Jacob, one of the characters in the Genesis stories, wrestles with an angel or with God, he gets a new name, and the name is Israel. That's where the word Israel comes from, and it means we who wrestle with God. And that really struck me because, well, it's a very strange story, this story of Jacob wrestling with an angel or with God and then being damaged, having his hip damaged. But what struck me even more than that, even though that's plenty strange, was the idea that the chosen people of God were those people who wrestled with God himself. That idea of wrestling, it's very different than the idea of just blind belief, right? Because it's conceptualized as a struggle, right? And a struggle that's, well, with the divine itself, and a dangerous struggle at that. And that it's those who voluntarily engage in that struggle who are, I suppose, blessed, to use the archaic language. And I realized too at that time that, well, that's to take your life seriously is to do exactly that, because to take your life seriously is to grapple with the most fundamental issues of moral orientation, how you're going to perceive the world, how you're going to conduct yourself in the world. And that's never obvious. And if it was obvious, life would be simple. It's never obvious. It's extraordinarily complicated because the world is a complicated place, and it's very hard to make the right decisions, to even determine what right might be. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And all the solutions, even if they're wise and well-grounded philosophically, still have to be particularized so that they fit the conditions of your life. And then it's so heartening in some sense that this ancient story makes the claim that it isn't those precisely, even who are faithful, so to speak, who are chosen by God in the positive sense, but those who actually engage in the act of the wrestling itself. And so that's the background for why I picked that title. And one of the things I've been trying to work through as I'm writing this book, because I'm currently writing it, it's probably about 75% done, something like that. I've got it plotted out. I know the basic story. There's too much to it now. It's too long, and so I have to cut. And I have to distinguish between the ideas that are already written down that are good and those that are excellent and central, and only keep the ones that are excellent and central. Well, that would be the plan, right? That's the aim. And I have the privilege, this is fun, I went to a monastery in Austria when I was there this spring, a place called Heiligenkreuz, which is this 800-year-old monastery. And it was unbelievably beautiful and peaceful place. And the monks who run this establishment also are specialists in Gregorian chanting, and they did an album sometime in the last decade that actually became a worldwide bestseller. Who would ever guess that? And so I went there to visit this place. It was interesting to see it because I'd spent a fair bit of time at Oxford and Cambridge, and both those universities are basically elaborations of monasteries, right? So they're aggregations of colleges. So a college is a specialized subunit of a university. A university is an aggregation of colleges, and each college is essentially an isolated quasi-monastery. It's based on the monastery architecture, and so, I spent some time at the University of Toronto, and before that at Harvard, sort of stepping back in time in educational institutions, because the University of Toronto is a fairly new institution. Harvard is an older institution, derived from the Oxford and Cambridge tradition, and then Oxford and Cambridge are much older, and they're based on an even older monastic tradition. And then I went to Heiligenkreuz, which is an actual monastery, which is extremely ancient. I could see how this whole educational establishment unfolded across time. Anyways, I get to go to Heiligenkreuz in April for 3 weeks and stay there, which should be very peaceful and interesting and beautiful, because they've been working on making this place beautiful for 800 years, and it's damn beautiful. And so I'm going to finish the book there. At least that's the hope. And one of the things I'm doing in this book is working out more thoroughly one of the rules that I laid out in Beyond Order, and it's part of a set of ideas that I've been working on really for 40 years, I would say. The rule is abandon ideology. Now, the impetus for writing that rule to begin with, I think, or at least one proximal impetus was a question that used to arise in one of the classes that I taught, both at Harvard and at the University of Toronto, which I started teaching at McGill back in 1992, I guess. I taught this class called Maps of Meaning, which was based on a book I wrote, which was also called Maps of Meaning, and it was a book I worked on for about 15 years. I worked on it about 3 hours a day for 15 years, and I was trying to crack a number of complicated problems, the most germane of which was why people were so emotionally committed to their beliefs. I was very interested in the relationship between belief and emotional regulation. And I was interested in that because people get upset if their beliefs are challenged, and so that's interesting. Why is it necessary to be upset? What role do beliefs have such that if they're disrupted, emotional dysregulation occurs, and of a very intense sort? I mean, people will die for their beliefs. That's something. And they'll also kill for their beliefs, and they'll commit atrocity in the name of their beliefs. And so this is a very serious issue, and obviously there's something fundamental about belief, given that its maintenance and its disruption can evoke such potent emotional responses and actions. And so Maps of Meaning was an investigation into the relationship between belief and emotional regulation. And I lectured about it for decades, and I would say that out of the effort I put into writing that book and then the lectures, decades of lectures, came the two more popular books I wrote, which more of you would be familiar with, and it was the process of lecturing about that first book that enabled me to differentiate what were rather complex ideas thoroughly enough so that they could be communicated more, I wouldn't say more popularly, because that isn't exactly the right way of thinking about it, but in a more accessible manner, I suppose. One that was more allied with storytelling rather than with, say, mere technical argument. And so I taught this Maps of Meaning course for a long time, once a year for 25 years. And it's about 40 hours of lectures. I redid it this year, by the way, for this Peterson Academy. You saw that brief ad. I got it down to 7 hours, which was a 400-page book compressed to 40 hours of lectures, now compressed to 8 hours of lectures. And so I'm finally getting to the point, after 40 years. So anyways, I was teaching this course, and it's a course about, I started to understand that beliefs have a narrative structure. Or you could reverse that and say, I started to understand that the reason we're so attracted to stories, implicitly, right, because we're obviously implicitly attracted to stories, will line up and pay to go see a story, say in a movie theater or at a live theater. We buy novels. If we can choose what to do with our time, we often choose to immerse ourselves in a story. And I would say that psychologists, generally speaking, really haven't taken that very seriously, especially the rationalist types who tend to think that, well, that's just entertainment, which begs the question, why is it entertaining, right? That's the germane question. You can't just casually brush that off and say, well, people are just doing that because it's entertaining. It's like, yeah, that means it grips you at the level of instinct. There's a real mystery there. And I started to understand, and I believe this to be technically true. In fact, I think since 1992, the science itself has converged on this conclusion, which is that we see the world through a story. We have to. We must see the world through a story. Or, to put it another way, that if you hear a verbal description of the structure through which people view the world, that is a story. And because viewing the world, perceiving the world, and then determining how to move forward in the world, because that's so complex and so likely to go wrong and so difficult to make go right, that we desperately want and need to expose ourselves to as many stories as possible, because we can gather the wisdom that is encapsulated in those stories without individually having to go through the terrible trials that would have made us wise enough to have formulated those stories ourselves. And so you could think about great storytellers as distillers of wisdom. But it's a strange wisdom. It's not the wisdom that is akin to the validity of a scientific theory. It's not ever more accurate descriptions of the patterns of the objective world, which is what we tend to think of as truth and what we tend to think of as knowledge. It's the wisdom that is the essence of seeing the world in the most productive and generous possible manner, and the wisdom that underlies our ability to craft our pathways forward in the optimal manner. And that's a great story. A great story is a portrayal of someone who has organized their perceptions and crafted their pathway forward in an optimal manner. Now, how do you know it's optimal? There's a question. Well, I think there are hints about that. One hint is that it grips you. You know, you see great stories. You're fortunate enough to be able to be exposed to great stories, and if you are presented with a great story, you're compelled by it. It's not exactly voluntary, right? It grips your interest even despite you in some sense. And it does it in a very strange manner, because a great story sometimes can be a very terrible story. It can be a story of great suffering and catastrophe. It can be a story of horror even. And it isn't exactly as if you're enjoying it in the sense of merely experiencing positive emotion while you're watching it. It can really upset you. And yet you'll pay for the opportunity to have that experience. And so, a great story compels your attention and burns itself into your memory. And so it appeals to you in a manner that's precognitive. That's another way of thinking about it. It grips you in a manner out of which thought emerges, rather than requiring that you think it through to begin with. You don't know why you're doing it. And this is very striking to me when I watch people respond to more archetypal movies. Some of you may know that I spent a lot of time, and there are lectures about this online, analyzing a set of different Disney movies. And the Disney movies are very interesting to me because they're so abstracted, right? First of all, they don't have real people in them. The animated movies, they have moving drawings of fictional people. It's really abstracted from reality. And the plots are strange. So the plot of Pinocchio, for example, is extraordinarily, surreally incomprehensible. The story's about a puppet, so a marionette. What's up with that? Why would you care? It's a story about a marionette who goes through a number of ethical trials, experimentation with deceit, experimentation with victimization, experimentation with hedonism, and who at the climax of that set of moral trials journeys to the deepest part of the ocean to confront a fire-breathing whale, and is thereby rescues his father and is transformed into something that's autonomous. It's like, what the hell is going on with that? And it's so mysterious because you can't really understand the plot. It's like, why is it that Pinocchio's father's in a whale? I mean, that's weird. You may have noticed that, but it's so interesting because you don't care when you're watching the movie. It's like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. It's like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. Not sense of the sort that you can describe explicitly, but it does make sense of the sort that grips you. And there's unbelievably deep imagery in that movie. It's quite miraculous. And the fact of that imagery is unsurprising in some sense because genius level artists made the movie, and so they had deep poetic and creative intuition, and it wouldn't have gripped the collective imagination as it did for decades, and still does, unless it struck the appropriate chord. And so it's a variant of the hero myth, the classic hero myth. The classic hero myth is confrontation with the dragon, let's say, and a fire-breathing whale is a dragon variant, and it's part of an older set of narratives that imply that one eternally appropriate pathway forward is the willingness to confront the terror that lurks in the depth, and that the consequence of that voluntary confrontation is the revitalization of whatever the father represents. It's a very interesting idea, unbelievably deep idea. You know, if you confront what terrifies you most deeply, the consequence of that will be the revitalization of the spirit of the Father itself within you. That's the proposition of the movie. And that's associated, strangely enough, with your freedom from being manipulated by forces other than by forces that are in the background. So that would be the strings, right, that operate the marionette, that frees you from that and transforms you from a puppet into something that's genuine and autonomous. It's a stunningly brilliant set of hypotheses, and implicit, right? Because it's presented in image. It's not an argument exactly. It's presented as a story, and the story grips you, and it grips you despite its surreal nature. And anyways, that my lecture series, Maps of Meaning, was about the structure of stories, and was predicated on the idea that we see the world through a story, and that there is a hierarchical ranking of stories in terms of their quality. Now, we all have an intuition of this. We all accept this, and that's an interesting thing to contemplate. We know full well that there's a difference between a deep story and a shallow story. You know, if you come home from work and you're tired, you're wiped out, you've had enough, you switch on the TV, you might want to watch just a junk story, you know, just light entertainment, light, whatever that means. Nothing heavy, nothing too deep, nothing too serious. All those words reflect something. They reflect what? They reflect the difference between what's deep and what's shallow. What does that mean? Well, the monster that Pinocchio encounters is in the depths, right? That's a deep encounter. And so that poetic image of the encounter in the depths lurks behind our understanding of the difference between shallow and deep. And it might be that you're tired enough, so you just want something shallow. You don't want to grapple with anything too profound. But then now and then you want something deeper, something that will move you, which is also a very interesting turn of phrase. And sometimes you want something that will change your life, and sometimes the story can be deep enough to change your life. Part of the reason that it's worthwhile, when it is, to become deeply educated in the humanities is so that you can expose yourself to the deepest stories and be transformed in consequence. At least that was the theory, although that's been replaced by ideology. And so my students, I would lay out an argument about stories and their relative importance, And the distinction, let's say, between a profound and true story and an ideology. And my students would ask me quite consistently, how do you know that what you're teaching isn't just another ideology? And that's a deep question. Here's what the question means. It's like, well, is there a rank order of story such that some stories are deeper and more reliable and more profound than others? If there is a rank order, and some are more shallow and more trivial or even wrong in some sense, that claim runs contrary to the moral relativism that predicated on the assumption that all ethical systems are sort of the moment and unpatterned, that each culture, let's say, has its own mode of representing the world, and there's no universal morality lurking, so to speak, or operating at the bottom of that. And so it's a question, that question, how do you know that what you're teaching isn't just another ideology, is a question about the nature of truth itself. And there's a psychological twist to it too, which is, well, I was putting forward a set of claims in my class, let's say, guiding students through the process of thinking it through, inviting them always, said, look, you listen to this argument, and if you don't find it compelling, well, fine. Like, I'm presenting to you an argument that I have been endeavoring to craft for decades. I've tried to take an axe to it in every possible way I could to see if I could knock anything out of it that couldn't withstand attack. And I'm only presenting to you what I couldn't destroy. But if you can find a flaw in it and offer an alternative, go right ahead. And I would say the same to you in the audience tonight. You have to ask yourself, as I lay out the argument, if it's in accord with your experience, right? If it strikes you as plausible, or if you can formulate an alternative. I'm talking to you about the things that I have not been able to formulate an alternative to. And but I took the question seriously, partly because also there's the psychological danger in it is the possibility of a narcissism on my part, because I'm a lecturer, say, and I have the captive audience of my students. I have the opportunity or temptation to use the comparative charisma of status that goes along with that to make what you might say an ideological case, right? I could leverage the fact of my relative status to be convincing about something that is in fact only another ideology that I'm putting forward for the purposes of, let's say, personal power and self-aggrandizement. And that's a perfectly reasonable, possible criticism as well, and one that anyone with any wisdom would be wise to attend to. And so, distinguishing between an ideology and a valid belief is, or even setting forth an argument that there is a distinction between those two things, it's a very tricky matter, because it gets to the heart of what constitutes truth itself, or even deeper than that, it is part of the argument about whether or not truth itself exists, especially in the moral domain. And say the moral domain is the domain that's concerned with how you perceive an act rather than the domain of what the world is as a set of objective patterns. Is there such a thing as moral truth in any fundamental and deep sense? And if so, what are the fundamental and deep moral truths? And how can they be reliably identified? And how do you know that the manner in which they're formulated isn't merely the process of manipulation on the part of the carrier of the idea in the service of their own status and power? So that's a standard postmodern critique, and one that's worth attending to, is that all storytellers are driven by the will to power. And it's all will to power. And if you claim otherwise, all that is an indication of how sophisticated you are in your ability to utilize power. And we know that all social institutions, all interpersonal relationships, even the relationship we have with ourselves, can be corrupted by the desire for power, and corrupted to some degree, and sometimes corrupted even ultimately, certainly the case with totalitarian systems. So it's definitely the case that drive to power can dominate. That's a different claim than the drive to power is the fundamental and only drive. And that's what I want to investigate more deeply tonight. The philosopher Immanuel Kant put forward a proposition about moral action, and he said, you should conduct yourself so that if your action became a universal maxim, so that everyone did it, that would be desirable. That's the categorical imperative. And it's an interesting idea that it's not as thoroughly developed. I hate to criticize Immanuel Kant, but it's not as thoroughly developed as it might be. But there's something in it that's true, and I want to explain why. So let me tell you. I'll start with something simple, deceptively simple. Behavioral economists have been investigating the principles by which ordinary people conduct their trading enterprises. And I don't mean merely economically. If you have a friendship, it's a trading enterprise, right? Because a friendship should be reciprocal. You offer something to your friend and they offer something back to you, and there's a voluntarily desirable balance there. And you would say the same thing with a relationship among peers. So hopefully the same obtains in your married life, let's say, is that you contribute and your wife or your husband contributes, and the contribution, insofar as it's possible, is mutual and reinforcing. So trade is a very wide spanning idea. How do people trade? Well, here's a game. This is a game that pits the idea of the self-interested individual against a higher order principle. So the way you play this game is you take two people. So I'll take you two, just if you don't mind. It's a very straightforward game. So here's the deal. I'm going to offer you $100. I'm not really, because we're just playing. But I'll offer you $100. But here's the rule. You have to offer the gentleman sitting to your left some of that. And if he accepts your offer, then the money's delivered and you split it. But if he rejects the offer, then neither of you get anything. So how much will you offer him? Okay, so the gentleman who I'm playing this game with said $50. And you think, well, so what? It's like, well, sometimes out of simple observations, great conclusions can be derived. So the fact that you offered $50 actually violates the tenets of classical economics, because the classical economics is predicated on the idea that people are maximizers of self-interest. Okay, and so what you should do in this game is you should offer your partner $1. Why? Well, you get $99, and obviously you wouldn't have played the game at all if you didn't think dollars were worthwhile, so why not just get all of them? And so then, and your partner should say, okay, and why? And the answer is, well, do you want $1 or do you want nothing? But this game has been played by dyads all over the world now, and everywhere people approximately offer 50%. Now, maybe it varies between 40 and 60%, but fundamentally it's 50%. Also everywhere, if it deviates substantially from 50%, say 95.5, the person to whom the offer is being made is very much likely to say, politely or not, up yours, right? And then you have to ask yourself, why? Okay, so just hold that in your imagination for a minute. We have this mystery. Why do people gravitate towards 50%? Now, this game is also being played with poor people. Because you might say, well, if you put someone under enough economic pressure, they'll take a lesser offer because they are in a state of absolute privation and they need the money more. And the research data indicate that if you're poor and you get a bad offer, you're more likely to reject it, not less. And you think, well, why would that be? And maybe it's something like, well, you might not have any money, but maybe you want to have some self-respect. And so I want you to hold that in your mind as well. Now, I'll tell you another story. Some of you have heard this story before, but maybe not in this context. There's a great scientist of emotion, Jacques Panksepp, who should have won a Nobel Prize for his work, in my estimation. It was groundbreaking. He studied the behavior of rats, juvenile male rats. And juvenile male rats, they like to play. And mammals like to play generally. Mammals have a play circuit. And there's a universal pattern of mammalian play. And you know this if you have a cat or a dog, or a sheep for that matter, goat, anything vaguely domestic and often wild as well. If you have any sense and you've been around dogs, you know the difference between a dog that wants to play fight and a dog that's aggressive. You can read from the bodily signals of the dog whether it's playing, mimicking aggression, let's say, or it's actually going to bite you. And if you're a well-socialized human being, especially in relationships to dogs, when a dog comes bouncing up, tail wagging, growling, but tail wagging and sort of dancing, you can give the dog a whack and you can start playing with it, you know. And rats play. And juvenile male rats like rough and tumble play. And they wrestle. And they wrestle quite a lot like human beings wrestle. They actually pin each other. And so you could imagine, and they want to wrestle. And you might say, well, how do you know what a rat wants? And the answer is behavioral psychologists figured that out like 40 years ago. You can tell what an animal wants because it will work to provide itself with the opportunity to do that. So you can train a rat to press a bar, and you can train it to learn that if it presses a bar enough, a gate will open and it can go into an arena where it gets to play, and then you can see how much the rat will work to play, and you can find out that a rat will work quite a lot to play. And so that's pretty interesting. It's not that much unlike you working to get enough money to buy a ticket to go to see a movie, which is also a form of play, because we'll say if you go to live theater, you say we go to see a play. So anyways, juvenile rats like to wrestle with each other, and if you pair them together and you observe pairings across multiple rats, one of the things you learn is that if one rat is 10% bigger than the other, the big rat can reliably pin the small rat. And that shouldn't come as any surprise, right? Size matters in a physical altercation, and 10% size advantage is enough to allow you to dominate. And so imagine you pair two juvenile rats together, and the big rat pins the small rat, so the small rat has to submit. The big rat is now dominant. You watch one interaction and you think, well, play aims at dominance, which is an expression of power, and the more powerful individual can dominate, and you can associate that with size and physical prowess. And that sort of goes along with the idea that, you know, the alpha chimp in a chimp troop is the roughest, toughest, meanest biker chimp, and he dominates the patriarchal structure with the expression of power. And that's a very common trope. It also turns out to be radically untrue. Now, Panksepp, being a genius, thought, well, wait a second here. Rats don't just play once. See, rats are very, very social. Here's something cool about rats. If you take a rat and you put it in a cage and isolate it, then you can get it addicted to cocaine. And so it'll just bar press for cocaine. It'll ignore food, it'll ignore water, it'll ignore the opportunity for sex. It'll just bar press for cocaine like mad. But if you raise rats, the same rats, in a social environment, so among their rat peers, among their rat friends, with their rat families, then you can't get them addicted to cocaine. And so that's quite cool. It's because they have something better to do. They're going to hang out with their friends. You know, they're going to go exploring. They're going to play. They're going to do rat things. And so then they don't have to be desperate enough to medicate themselves with an artificial psychomotor stimulant. And so rats are highly social, extraordinarily social, very intelligent creatures. So let's say now you know that, and you know that each rat is in a social environment in its natural state. Here's how deeply social rats are and how important it is that they know each other. If you have a rat colony and you take a rat out of it and you wash him, say with soap, a nice clean rat, you throw him back in the rat society, the other rats will kill him right away. Because he's not the rat they know. And so all the rats, they know each other, and rats have an unbelievably good sense of smell, and every rat has every other rat that they live with figured out and mapped. And so you introduce a strange rat, it's like, nope, no strange rats, death now. And so it's the maintenance of the social organization is very, very important to rats. And that's relevant, by the way, to a question that I raised earlier, which is why is belief so important to us? Why will we kill to maintain our beliefs? Part of the reason for that is that it's very important to us to maintain our social order. And so, anyways, rats live in societies and they get along with each other. They interact with each other repeatedly, and they form a social structure that's predictable and functional as a consequence of the balancing of these repeated interactions. Okay, so what? Okay, well, that means that rats don't just play once. They play repeatedly. Now, then you might ask yourself, are the rules of conduct in a single game the same or different than the rules of conduct in a game that repeats? And now, this is a very deep question, and here's why. Personally, you play a game with your husband or wife that repeats. Right? The days repeat. The interactions you have with them repeat. If the relationship is going to work, you have to abide by a pattern of interaction that will sustain itself with repetition. And then you might ask yourself, well, will any old pattern of interaction do? And the answer is absolutely not. There are extraordinarily tight constraints on the nature of a pattern of playful interaction that repeats productively. Now, we all know this, we tell our children, doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. And what we mean by that is, the victory in the current game is not the victory of ultimate importance. You want to conduct yourself during the current game so that your manner of behavior indicates to others that you would be a good person to invite to play repeatedly. Right? And we don't know that that's what we mean when we tell our children, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. What we're saying is, don't sacrifice the ethic of iterable play to any local victory. It's a profound moral claim. And we know this instinctively if we have a child who's a star on the playing field, but who hogs the ball and who is narcissistically self-aggrandizing in relationship to his teammates, we're likely to respond to that with ethical discomfort, even if the child truly is, at the level of skill, the star. Because we know it's not all about you, and that's not good enough. And if you're truly the star of the show, in the most fundamental sense, you're trying to develop the skills of your teammates, right? You're able to take defeat in stride honorably. You don't gloat too much if you win. And you might say, well, why do we draw those conclusions? The answer is because we know there's a cross-game morality. Now, back to the rats. If you pair the rats together again, so the big rat has dominated the little rat, allowing you as a scientist to draw the conclusion that physical prowess and power constitutes the basis for dominance. Now you pair them repeatedly. You watch what happens when they're paired together the second time. Same rats. The little rat has to invite the big rat to play. So that's what's been established. So the big rat can stand there being cool, and the little rat has to bounce around, and the big rat can deign to play, and that's sort of his reward for having won the first bout. But the little rat has to want to play with him, because otherwise he won't invite the play. Now, if you pair the rats together repeatedly, if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win at least 30% of the time, the little rat will stop asking him to play. And that is it's so cool. That's so cool. This is why I think Panksepp should have won a Nobel Prize. That's an unbelievably profound discovery, because it shows that there's an ethic of iterated play that's so deep that it even arises in rats. And so then you might say, well, what does that have to do with you? And the answer is, it's the same ethic that you need to embody in your day-to-day life. Now imagine that you watch a Hollywood movie. These are a very common plot. You know, you have an athlete who does what he can, who's very skilled as a player, but does what he can to develop the team. Or maybe you have a coach that's doing the same thing, right? The coach is trying to make the players skilled, but at the same time he's teaching them to be good men and women. That's happening simultaneously, and that's what makes the coach admirable. And so the coach is attentive to the fact that a given game needs to be won, but he won't subordinate that to the ethical requirement of making decent men and women out of the athletes. And that'll be a uplifting Hollywood movie where you see the triumph of the ethical coach, say, over the unethical coach who's hyper concerned with local victory. Everybody walks away from that feeling satisfied and good about humankind and maybe good about themselves. And they should feel that way, because that plot points to a deep truth, and it's a truth that's not, it doesn't indicate a moral relativism. So here's another take on this. So boys and girls, imagine boys and girls, boy and a girl playing together, and the girl and the boy decide, say they're 3 or 4, because this is about when this kind of play emerges. 2 is too young, starts to emerge around 3, and the kind of play I'm describing really runs intensely till about 8 or 9. It still lurks in the background of our lives, but that's the developmental period. The boy will say to the girl, perhaps, do you want to play? And the girl might say, yes. And maybe the boy will say, well, would you like to play house? And the girl will say, okay. And then maybe she'll say, well, you be the daddy and I'll be the mommy, and then they'll decide where the house is, and then they run a little simulation, right? And they don't exactly imitate their parents, because imitation would mean acting out their precise actions the way that you might copy someone, you know, when you adopt the same body posture as them. The kids are more sophisticated than that. They abstract out something like the pattern of the father and the pattern of the mother, and they imitate that. And they need to imitate that, because that's what they're trying to aim at being, right? And so when they're playing, they're adopting a fictional mode of adult behavior, and that would be the embodiment of the spirit of the father and the spirit of the mother. But then there's an additional constraint that's extraordinarily worth considering. If I'm the boy and the girl's there, I have to embody that spirit in a manner that makes the game fun for her. And what does fun mean? It means, well, first of all, it means eliciting positive emotion. That's sort of like a technical definition of fun. It means not producing too much anxiety or negative emotion, because that's not fun. Maybe a bit, because there might be a little challenge in it, but it can't become too much or the play will stop because people will get upset. And so there's this very narrow set of preconditions that are necessary for the game to be desirable and to continue. And one of the preconditions is that both players have to voluntarily want to play. And so imagine that there's a pattern of behavior that iterates properly across time, that characterizes optimized relationships, that's predicated on the joint willingness to continue the game. Okay, so how do children form friendships? Well, if you put a boy and a girl together and they play well together once, they're going to be motivated to repeat the experience. And if they repeat the experience several times and that works, then they're starting to cement a friendship. And so then you can imagine that the friendship is a consequence of the ability to manifest the appropriate pattern of play across multiple instances of play. And you could consider that an analog of the idea of good sport. When you tell your child to be a good sport, what are you saying? Be the sort of person that other people line up to play with voluntarily. Now, why would I say that exists only within a very tight set of constraints? Well, the psychological data on this, mostly derived from animal experiments, shows that play is actually quite a fragile motivational state. Almost any other motivation or emotion that isn't play-related can disrupt it. So kids can't play if they're hungry or thirsty or tired or upset or even overexcited. The interaction has to be very tightly optimized for the game to make itself manifest. You say, well, why do boys and girls play house, and why do they try to make it into a jointly desirable game? And the answer is because that's what they're aiming to do later in life. And then you might say, and this is a good thing to know, what principle should guide the interaction you have, let's say, with your intimate partner or with your friends for that matter? And it's not domination or power. That's a major deviation from the optimized path. It's more like the willingness and ability to maintain the spirit of sustained iterable play. And then you think, well, wouldn't that be desirable? Because then you'd have a wife, let's say, or a husband who's your friend, who you could play with continually. And you might ask yourself too, what exactly are you doing when you're playing? And that's worth noting as well. So imagine that you're playing one-on-one basketball and you can pick your opponent. You might think, well, the point is victory, so I'm going to pick someone who's never seen a basketball. And I'm going to just humiliate them on the field, and to my own benefit, like the man, say, who would offer his trading partner $1 and take 99. The point is victory. I'll find a useless opponent. I'll just crush the life out of him, and I win. And then you might ask, well, why not do that if the point is victory? And one answer would be, well, that's just not any fun. And then there's a deeper question under that, which is, well, why isn't it fun if the point is the victory? And the answer is, because that's not the point. That's a point, it's a micro point, it's embedded in something that's a much broader point. Actually, what you want, if you have any sense when you set up a game, is you want to find an opponent, let's say, or a partner in competition and cooperation, who's about as skilled as you are, or maybe slightly more skilled. Why? Well, what are you doing when you're playing? Well, you're trying to win the game, but you're also trying to advance in your capacity to win a set of games. And the way you do that is by increasing your skill, and obviously the way that you increase your skill is by pitting yourself against an opponent who can push you to the limits of your skill. And that's what you want in a partner. And to some real degree, that's what you want in a friend, is you want to set up a beneficially adversarial relationship so that you both push each other to the edge of the development of your skill. And that's not only is that iterable across time because you want to do it voluntarily and so you don't have to use force on each other, but it optimizes your psychological development and increases the integrity of the relationship. And so, and you know, what do you want from a partner? Do you want like blind obedience? Not if you're not a tyrant, and you certainly don't want to be subjected. You certainly don't want to be required to manifest nothing but blind obedience yourself, unless you want to be a slave. You want someone to contend with in an interesting way, right? You even do that when you're dancing. There's an element of mutual patterning and encouragement to play and develop in the dance, which is why we like to dance, by the way. You want someone to contend with, and then you contend with them, let's say, in the spirit of voluntary play. And the more expert you get at that, the more intense the play, and the more engaging the play, and the more radical the development, and the more continual the development, and the more stable the relationship, and the more optimal the pathway of psychological development. And so then you might say, to return this all to the question at the beginning, what's not an ideology? It's a description of that pattern. A story that encapsulates that pattern is not an ideology. It's the right story. And it's interesting too, because it's not only right in the moral sense. And let's say the moral sense is, well, if you act out this story, you'll develop optimally, and the social organizations that you're part of will develop optimally and expand. It's deeper than that, because you could think about that as mere morality, but it's not just that, because that pattern is an emergent consequence of something objectively real. So the objective reality is that there is a pattern that is a necessary precondition for the continuation of a game. And that pattern actually exists, like it's implicit in the world itself. It's implicit as a fact in the world itself. When you act out the fact, then that's something you're doing morally, but the fact is there. You can observe it in rats. You can observe it in chimpanzees. It turns out that if you do the appropriate analysis with chimpanzees, even though they have a patriarchal social structure, it's a male, the higher status individuals in a chimp troop tend to be male. There are many high status females as well. So then you might ask, well, who are the high status males? And the answer is, if the high status male is a bully, is only high status, has preferential access to reproductive opportunities because of the expression of power, so brute force and compulsion. First of all, this troop is very unstable, and second, that particular chimp is extraordinarily likely to meet a quick and violent death at the hands of his peers. It's unstable power, even among chimpanzees. And so the alpha chimps who are successful are expert peacemakers and highly reciprocal. They're often the most reciprocal individuals in the entire troop, and not infrequently, small males can be alphas because they're so socially skilled. And so they're experts at playing a reciprocal game. And so that's so cool, because what it implies, all of this implies, is that the proper basis for sovereign authority is the sophisticated ability to play a reciprocal game. And that's the antithesis of power. And it's the justification for the claim of sovereignty itself. What should be sovereign? Well, that's what should be put in the highest place. What should be the spirit to which we all bow. That's another way of thinking about it. The spirit we should abide by. That's sophisticated capacity for reciprocal play. And when you see someone in a movie, when you see someone in a story who embodies that pattern, that elicits admiration, that elicits the desire to mimic. That's because we can recognize that pattern, and it echoes within us. It calls to us it compels us and attracts our attention, and it burns itself into our memory. And we're motivated to allow that spirit to possess us and to act it out in our lives. And to the degree that we're able to manage that, then we tread the optimal path. And to the degree that we're able to describe that, then we're telling a great story. And to the degree that we can extract out moral principles as a consequence of analyzing that story, we're developing a system of beliefs that's not an ideology. It is instead a system of belief that's reflective of the process that properly orders the psyche and society simultaneously. And so, why would you abandon ideology? Well, why would you abide by power if you could abide by the spirit of voluntary play? What possible advantage could there be to that? And then you could also ask yourself, well, what's a more optimistic vision, right? That we're all possessed by the desire to dominate and compel and control, and that's the basis for political sovereignty and authority itself. Nothing but force, right? Compulsion at the point of a gun, because that's the only way you can get people to listen. It's like, no. You can invite people to play. And the person who's best at that is the proper sovereign. And that's true insofar as you're attempting to govern, the loose aggregation of subpersonalities that's you, but also attempting as best you can to set up your social relations in the most stable, productive, and generous manner and desirable manner possible. And none of that, as far as I can tell, is arbitrary. In fact, quite the contrary. I think it's reflective of the deepest truth, literally the deepest truth. And so, it's for that reason that you might be encouraged to distinguish between ideology and deep truth, and then to abandon ideology for something that's clearly preferable and superior in all possible manners. And so, that's the difference between an ideology and something that's fundamentally morally true, as far as I can tell. Thank you very much. I'll be back in a moment.
Murmur. I love all the murmuring. I wonder what it is you guys talk about after he finishes. I can never hear it. All I can hear is everywhere. So you guys put some good questions together. I got a few of them written down, and sometimes we get through one or two, but I haven't lots of them written down, so we'll see. So was that a good lecture? Yeah? Oh, good. I'm glad. Okay, well, let's invite him back on stage. Are you wreaking havoc with the ideologies? Yeah? Is that what you're doing?
Enticing people out of them.
Ah, I see. Okay, here's one. This week I discovered my wife was having an affair. I still love her despite the betrayal. How do I navigate this? That's an easy one, huh?
So if you came to me and as a client, say, of my clinical practice, I would help you take that question apart. This week I discovered that my wife was having an affair. So, did you discover that this week? Or were there clues and hints for a very long period of time? And I'm not suggesting that that's the case, by the way, to this particular individual. I don't know anything about the person who asked this question, and so I would also ask whoever that is not to presume that I'm speaking directly to their concerns, because I don't know that person well enough to do that. I have to provide something approximating a generic answer. In order for that to be rectified, you need to know what exactly happened here. What's the significance of this event? And that's one vicious question. Now, the person asking the question also leaps to an immediate conclusion. So there's a big problem here. My wife had an affair, question mark. What's going on? But then they provide an answer. I still love her, and what's the next part of it exactly?
Wants to know how to navigate it.
Right, so the answer is I still love her, and I need to know how to navigate forward. It's like, well, I'm not so convinced of that, by the way. Are you not angry? Are you not upset, frustrated, disappointed, anxious, hurt, betrayed, traumatized? Or is there a part of you who now knows the relationship is over, and because it wasn't a very good relationship, you're thrilled because now you have the right to engage in the same sort of devious pathway to hypothetical freedom that your wife took? Because that can certainly be the case. When a bomb like that goes off in the midst of your life, everything is up for grabs. And so to immediately say, I still love her, it's like, yeah, maybe and maybe not. And if that's all you feel, well, then that in itself is definitely a problem, and also might be key to why it happened to begin with, because you appear to be the sort of person who can be stomped on pretty damn hard and not object. And like I said to the person who asked this question, I am not talking about you. I don't know anything about you, and I'm not presuming. I'm just laying out the potential landscape. What other problems do you have? How long have you been married? Is the whole damn thing a lie? Is every relationship you've ever had a lie? Are you a complete doormat? Are you blind beyond capacity? Have you married someone who's psychopathic or narcissistic? Do you have a pattern of associating with people like that? Those are all questions that are going to plague and should plague you in some real sense when something like that happens. So the first issue is, well, what the hell happened? And man, that can take 1,000 hours that should have been spent in discussion with your wife before this happened, trying to get to the bottom of it. People are often traumatized by that kind of revelation, and the reason they're traumatized is because, well, imagine you have a committed relationship with someone, so you might ask, what is the basis of the commitment? And there's a hierarchy of commitment in that some commitments are more fundamentally important than others, and those are the commitments upon which all other commitments rely. And so when you set up a household with someone and you move towards a permanent intimate relationship, and hypothetically in the direction of, let's say, having dependent children, then you're doing all that based on the presupposition that the person is faithful to you, because that's one of the defining attributes of the relationship itself. And so when that axiomatic presupposition is shattered, then everything dependent on that is now questionable, and that not only includes the present, what the hell is going on now, the future, what are we going to do, who am I with anyways, but also the past itself, because you were living, let's say, in something approximating a fool's paradise, and nothing that you thought to be the case was in fact the case. And so that's a dreadful problem. And how you cobble something like that back together is a very, very difficult problem. I would say the first thing you do is Open yourself up to the admission of the magnitude of the problem. What's the problem? Who am I, anyways, that this happened to me? Who are other human beings that they could do this to each other? Right? So those are fundamental questions about the nature of social relationships themselves, or even about individual identity. Very, very unsettling questions. Someone I loved has the capacity for that magnitude of betrayal. That's a dreadful realization, not least in part because it also implies to some degree that you also have the same capacity. Dante wrote a book, the divine, oh now I can't remember the name of the book, the Inferno. And the Inferno, it's from the Inferno that we derive many of our ideas about hell, our poetic, imaginative representation of the domain of, the underworld domain of darkness and catastrophe. And at the bottom of hell, Dante put Satan himself, but one rung above that, he put those who betray. And betrayal is the inversion of trust, right? You can't betray me unless I've trusted you. And trust is the precondition for all social relations. And so to betray someone who deeply trusts you is to demolish the foundation of relationship itself. And so that's why Dante placed it way deep down in the substructure of hell. And so when betrayal occurs, then you're faced with all those problems. In a therapeutic environment, I would walk the person through their marriage. It's like, let's lay out the story and see if we can figure out where things went wrong. And I wouldn't presume to know as a therapist at all, because each person's catastrophe is very particularized and singular. And all I would be able to do in that situation is to listen to the account of the past, let's say, and to ask the person to clarify when I didn't understand, and to see if I could evoke from them a coherent and plausible causal account of the pathway to the catastrophe that was differentiated and detailed enough so that once they understood it, they would be less likely to repeat it. And that's how you recover from something like this. You recover from something like this by not being the sort of person to whom that will ever happen again. And that might be, and it could be, as I alluded to earlier, that now and then people get unlucky and they partner with someone who is fundamentally and malevolently unreliable. And that's brutal if that occurs. And you might think, well, there's no people that are fundamentally and malevolently unreliable. And I would say, well, you're either naive and you better watch out because one of these adventures is coming your way, or you've been unbelievably fortunate and have just never encountered someone like that. And so I would find out from the person just exactly what it is they think they've encountered, and to try to characterize that. They've certainly encountered the spirit of betrayal, no doubt about that. Have they encountered their own capacity for naive, willful blindness? Probably. All of that has to be rectified before this shattered reality can be put back together. And it has to be rectified, and that's an extraordinarily complicated problem. The answer to the problem is, how do I now move forward knowing what I know about my own capacity for blindness and the ability of others, even when trusted, to engage in deep betrayal? And that's are there general principles for that? There are. One thing you'll have to do to recover is to regain your willingness to trust. But it can't be naive, because look where that got you. It has to be wise and courageous. And so to recover from this, you're going to have to be able to trust again. But trust will have to be predicated on something like courage rather than naivety. And the courage is something like the courage all wise people have when they undertake a relationship, which is something like, I know perfectly well that you're chock full of snakes, just like me. But the best pathway forward, nonetheless, is for us to extend a hand in trust to each other and see if we can build a valid and solid and sustainable and iterable relationship despite our mutual inadequacies and our proclivity for malevolence. And there isn't a better there isn't a better pathway forward than that. And that is, pathway is predicated on the ability to adopt a posture of attentive trust. And so it's frequently the case that someone in this situation has to mature past their naivety, and that's a very painful thing to do, and then to regain their footing. Now, the final part of this is, can you do that with the person that you are now married to? And the answer is, well, you didn't do it the first time, so I wouldn't count on it. Does that mean it's impossible? No, but it's going to require a lot of courageous digging to get to that point. A lot of admission of rage, too. No, it's like, I am so upset with you that it isn't obvious to me that I could ever forgive you. I don't even know how I would do that. Can you help me figure that out? Well, then you have to trust the other person to convince you that they're now trustworthy. Well, maybe they can do that. And you can refer to your own resentment. One of the pathways to forgiveness is to have the person who's wronged you confess, right? And to confess is to give a detailed and compelling, accurate, differentiated, causal account of the betrayal. It's like, here's exactly what happened. Here's the multiple instances. Here's my entire set of motivations. This is why I was so angry with you that I thought that this betrayal was acceptable. Here's why I was so impulsive and shallow that I believed that the affair was justifiable. Right? That has to go all the way down to the depths, to a depth that's as deep as the betrayal itself. And maybe once that confession has been made manifest and a plan has been put forward that is indicative of the willingness and ability to change, that a reconfigured relationship can be newly established and move forward on that basis. But, man, it's a tough row to hoe, and it's highly unlikely. So, there's a rule in this book: do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, people hide a lot of unwanted things in the fog in their relationships, and sometimes the consequence of that is a deep betrayal, and the medicine for that, the necessary antidote for that, is to reveal all those hidden things. And God, in a relationship that's gone spectacularly wrong, that can be like 10,000 things that weren't faced in the course of the relationship. And every single one of them has to be resurrected and thought through. So, unfortunately, in some sense, that's fated as well, because once you've been hurt like that, there isn't an alternative in terms of reconstituting yourself. There isn't another option. You have to face everything that made you vulnerable in that manner to begin with. And that's a lot to face, especially all at once, especially when you've been avoiding it for maybe decades or maybe your whole life. It's rough. So good luck with it. And don't pretend. Here's a piece of advice. And as a therapist, I generally don't give people advice because that isn't the role of a therapist. Do not pretend to be better than you are in this situation. Right? The fact that you're enraged, let's say, and you should be, is actually, that has to be fully admitted and worked through, because otherwise you'll reconstitute the relationship on unbelievably on shaky grounds, and some crisis will come your way that's not even very serious and blow you into bits again. So you'll be able to forgive the person if they can confess and transform deeply enough so that your rage is actually genuinely eliminated. And that's going to take a lot of effort, man, and a lot of honesty, a lot of willingness to see that you are in fact that demolished and outraged. That's a vicious pit to contemplate.
What are your thoughts on ADHD? I'm 16, in high school, and it seems that more and more students are being put on meds to fix their lack of discipline.
Yeah, I think it's just like psychiatric, except in extraordinarily rare cases. There are people who are neurologically damaged, who have physiological reasons for difficulty in maintaining optimized attentional focus. You see that in people, for example, who have fetal alcohol syndrome. Most of the time, as far as I'm concerned, it's a rubbish diagnosis. Panksepp, the same neuroscientist that I talked to you about, who investigated play behavior in rats, also noted, this is quite fun, that if you deprive juvenile male rats of the opportunity to play boisterously, they become hyperactive. And also, if you deprive them of the opportunity to play optimally, their prefrontal cortices do not mature well. And the prefrontal cortex matures late, and it constitutes, in some sense, the pinnacle of neurological development, and it needs to develop in the course of intense play. And then he noticed that if you administered hyperactive play-deprived rats amphetamine, Ritalin, that it would inhibit their frenetic playing. And that's pretty much what's happening in schools. So the schools are not well adapted to boys. I don't think they're particularly well adapted to girls either, by the way, but they're particularly not well adapted to boys. Boys aren't designed to sit still and be bored out of their skulls for 7 hours a day. And there are boys with particular temperaments who are even less inclined to be able to do that. So, for example, if you're extroverted, highly social, possessed by a fair bit of enthusiasm and positive emotion, then you're going to appear more hyperactive. If you're creative, then your attention is going to be fragmented in some sense by the multiplicity of your interests. So if you're creative and extroverted, then you have both of those working against you in terms of your quiescent adaptation to the school environment. If you're disagreeable, which is also more likely if you're male, then you're quite likely to push back against what you see as stupid, arbitrary rules. And so we know perfectly well, for example, that attention deficit disorder overlaps with childhood conduct disorder and antisocial behavior. And I'm not saying that all children diagnosed with hyperactivity are conduct disordered. I'm saying that more aggressive boys tend to manifest symptoms that sometimes tilt them towards juvenile criminality and sometimes tilt them towards attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. But it's partly their somewhat rebellious temperament. And so if you're disagreeable and extroverted and creative, then why wouldn't you be hyperactive? And then you might say, So when amphetamines were first used to treat hyperactivity, the hypothesis was the following. Kids who are hyperactive or attention deficit disordered are of a different neurological type. Now, as I said, in rare circumstances, that's true. But absent evidence for neurological dysfunction, I would hesitate to make that presumption. The run-of-the-mill hyperactive boy, if you put him on amphetamines, Ritalin, his attentional focus improves. Now, the original hypothesis was that's because these abnormally neurologically structured hyperactive boys have a paradoxical reaction to amphetamine administration. It calms them down, whereas with normal people, they become more stimulated, okay? There's a word for that theory, and the word is wrong. Okay, so more intelligent and differentiated analysis has indicated that if you give any child amphetamines, the grip of what they're attending to is stronger. So all children are calmed down by stimulants perversely because the psychomotor stimulant, which is a dopamine agonist, which activates the focal exploratory system, does increase the capacity for focal attention. But it does that with all children, and so a positive reaction to amphetamine in relationship to attentional focus is no indication whatsoever, even in the most minute manner, that the diagnosis was correct. And so, I don't buy it, except in these rare cases, is that we use amphetamines to conveniently modify the behavior of bored boys because we're too stupid to construct our education systems in a manner that doesn't drive them mad. Look, you know, normal university students take Ritalin like mad in university because they learn that they can sustain attention, whether that's productive or not in the long run is a whole different issue, but they can sustain attention with less effort if they use amphetamines. Now, that's a degenerating game, fundamentally, like most drug use. And I suppose if it's very carefully regulated and the doses are low, then the negative consequences are less dramatic. But I think the whole thing's just, it's a psychosocial fraud. It's a, what do they call that? When a system produces there's a name for a disease that's created by doctors. I can't remember it. What's the word? Iatrogenic? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, hyperactivity is an iatrogenic disease created by schools. Yeah, that's the case. So, boys should play more, way more than they do, way more. They should play to the point of exhaustion in some sense every day. Really, really. They'll quit when they've had enough.
One more question.
One more question. I bet your hyperactive son has no trouble paying attention when he's playing video games. Well, that's worth thinking about, isn't it?
What steps should someone take to start developing delayed gratification when they constantly give in to instant gratification?
Well, okay, imagine, I know the answer to this to some real degree because I had graduate students in particular who I picked because they were very smart and often very creative, but sometimes they weren't very conscientious. So they had a hard time delaying gratification. And so, well, I would say if you would like to discipline yourself, which is a very good idea, you need to pick a direction. Pick a direction you want to go first. Pick a goal you would like to attain. And a medium to long-term goal. You might imagine something you need and want, some attainment that would motivate, whose pursuit would motivate you. And you can ask yourself that. It's a good question to ask yourself in general, This is a very good question to ask yourself is, if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would that be? And that's a meditative question. You don't want to force an answer out of yourself. You want to ask yourself that like you would ask someone else. If I could have what I wanted, what would that look like? And you can ask yourself that in a more differentiated way. If I could have the relationship that I needed and wanted, if I could have the friendships, if I could have the job or career, if I could have the educational pathway, if I could adopt civic responsibility in an optimized manner, if I could engage in some creative enterprise, if I took care of myself properly, if I regulated my susceptibility to temptations, what would that look like if it was optimized? And then that sets you up a goal that has some motivational force. This is worth doing. And then you might find, well, you don't do it anyways. And then I would say, well, that's because you're biting off more than you can chew. The next goal is to take your goal and to fragment it into micro goals until you find a micro goal that's small enough that it still presents some challenge that you will do. And so I've become, one of the things I'm known for, I suppose, is my advice to people to clean up their rooms. And the people who think I'm their enemy laugh about that rule because of its simplicity, let's say. But the only reason they think it's simple is because they've never tried it. It's actually extremely difficult. And it was very frequently the case that, well, it's very difficult to put your room, your office, your bedroom in order. I mean, you think about your bedroom, hypothetically, let's say you're married, you share that room with someone else. Is your bedroom in order? Really? And I don't just mean, is it neat? Maybe it's too neat. Maybe it's too orderly. Maybe it's too sterile. Maybe it's too bare. Maybe that characterizes your whole bloody relationship. Maybe, really? And maybe that is genuinely reflected in the state of your room, because it's very probable that that room is a microcosm of your marriage. It's highly probable. And so what that would mean is to organize that room would require the organization of your marital life, not least because if you want to put that room in order, you're going to have to negotiate with your wife about how that's going to be done. And while you're making that negotiation, even in relationship to the micro details, you're going to encounter almost everything that's wrong with your relationship. And so, you might ask yourself when you walk into your bedroom, I hate this bedroom. It's like, you should really think that through. And then you need to think through what you would need to do so that you love that room, or even more complexly, so that you both loved it, because that's a tough thing to attain, boy, because you're going to have differences in taste, you're going to have differences in orderliness. There's all sorts of things that you're going to have to negotiate in order to make that room you both inhabit jointly desirable. Anyways, you set yourself a goal, ask yourself what goal you want to set, and then break the goal down into steps that are small enough so that even someone as pathetic as you could manage them. And that requires a tremendous humility. I know it was frequently the case, for example, with my clients, that I would do an analysis of their situation in life, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that someone was 30, living at home, in the bedroom they grew up in high school, in a complete bloody state of disorder, both moral and practical. And one of the relatively simple steps that we might agree upon with regards to moving forward is the person might think, well, you know, I'm 30, I'm really immature, I haven't taken any responsibility for my life, my mother still makes my bed and cleans up after me. It's like, well, why don't you just start with that? You know, because you're not going to just fix your life. Why don't you just try to clean up your room like you're a mature 14-year-old instead of a dreadfully dismal 30-year-old. And so, first of all, it's really hard for someone, even if they're desperate, to admit that that's necessary, right? Because it's so bloody humiliating. I mean, really, I'm so damn useless that my basic goal is going to be to clean up my bedroom. It's like, well, looks like it. And actually, it's worse than that, because then you ask the person, you negotiate with the person, they say, well, I'll try to clean up my room. Then they come back the next week and they say, I had one client, this was so funny, he's going to vacuum his rug. That was his goal for the week. He just had a child out of wedlock, and he was afraid that he was going to be a very bad father, which was a very realistic fear. And so he wanted to put himself together, you know, and so that's why he came to see me. And he lived in this squalor, and one thing we decided to do was that he could vacuum the rug, which he hadn't done for like 12 years because his mother would do it. And so it was so funny, it's so unbelievably comical. He went and got the vacuum, a stand-up vacuum, an upright vacuum, and he brought it into his room, but he didn't bring it all the way in. He put it in the doorway, leaning like this across the doorway. And then instead of vacuuming his room, he stepped over that bloody vacuum cleaner for a whole week and then came and told me that he couldn't do it. It's like, it's not surprising to me at all, because you think, well, that's such a trivial thing. It's like, if it was such a trivial thing, he'd have a clean room. It's not trivial at all. That chaos in his immediate environment was deeply emblematic of the chaos of his life. They were the same thing. And so for him to even begin the process of bringing order to chaos, which is a divine process, by the way, and the highest moral requirement, he had to be willing to face the catastrophe, the chaotic catastrophe of his life. And he hadn't done that for like 30 years. Why was he going to start that week? Just because he said he was going to? It's like, good luck. So what you do as a therapist in that situation is you just make the task smaller until you find a task so small, but still moving forward, that the person will do. So I might have said, I don't remember the particulars of the situation, I might have said, well, do you think you can get that vacuum cleaner, do you think you could move it out of the doorway into your room? That's all you have to do this week. Do you think you can do that? And I'd say that and offer that without being contemptuous. Like, you have to be very careful about such things. And I know that this is more complicated than it looks. And I also know that the first step taken towards the domination of chaos and its transformation into order is a cardinal and difficult step. And so you can make it small, and that's fine, it'll still work. So I might say, well, just move the vacuum cleaner inside your room. And then I would also say to someone in that situation, don't do more than that. If the agreement that you've made with me and with yourself is that that's enough, abide by the contract that you've written with yourself, and allow yourself to be grateful for the fact that you had the courage to take even a single step forward. And don't push your bloody luck, because maybe you'll have a brief fit and vacuum the whole rug, and then you'll be so annoyed at how you've destabilized your entire life that you'll redouble your attempts to make a mess, and the place will be more like hell than ever for 2 months. It's very probable that that sort of thing will occur if you break the contract you've set with yourself. The upside of this is, because you think, oh my God, that's so dismal, I have to start that low. It's like, yeah, probably, especially if it's a real difficult thing you're trying to sort out. You have to start as low as you are useless, and that's low. So, but the upside is that progress accelerates, it's not linear, and so if you take once you take the first step, the probability that you'll take a slightly larger second step increases, and that increases non-linearly. And so once you get the ball rolling, so to speak, once you start pushing the rock uphill, you can do it faster and faster. And so even if you have to start in a very humiliating manner, that doesn't mean that's where you'll end. One of the things that Tammy and I learned to do, and this was a consequence of me being trained as a behavior therapist, is, we'll just take an example that maybe I was trying to learn how to compliment her when she dressed nicely. And maybe the fact that I wasn't good at that was manifest in the fact that she'd put some effort into her dress, and then I wouldn't respond in the appropriate manner, and that would dishearten her. And I don't particularly remember that exactly happening, but it'll be a perfectly reasonable example. And so then she would be displeased. And then the question would be, well, is she displeased because I'm too stupid to offer a proper compliment? Or is she displeased because she's so needy and lacking confidence that she needs a compliment that would go beyond the ordinary? And the answer is, what the hell do we know? Could be one or the other or both. And so what's a possible solution to that? And one possible solution would be, okay, if you do put some effort into your appearance, or I do, we could reverse the situation, but if you put some effort into your appearance, and you would like to hear from me exactly the words that would reward you for doing that and provide you with the confidence to attempt it again in the future, what would those words be?
You look good without a beard, dear.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Very funny. Very funny. And then you can say, well, if you tell me those words, I will repeat them back to you. And then the person who needs the words might object, well, that's false, it's superficial, it's artificial, it's not spontaneous. And if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to tell you what to say. It's like, well, all of that's wrong. It's like, just because I love you doesn't mean I'm not stupid. And so, in fact, I love you might even be evidence that I am, in fact, stupid. So like, help me out here. I don't know what you want, and maybe you could just tell me, and then I'll tell you what you want, and I'll do it stupidly and badly. But I'll be slightly better at it the next time, and maybe if you let me practice 50 times stupidly and badly, I'll get reasonably good at it, and then that's something that we'll be both good at for the rest of our lives. And that's something worth knowing. If you imagine you're upset with your partner because they haven't delivered something to you, whatever it is that you want, and then there's two questions that arises, right? Are you just like immature and greedy and self-centered, or are they useless and incapable of delivering? And neither of you know, and you have to sort that out. And then you also, as the injured party, let's say, might regard it as a moral necessity on your part to indicate to your partner exactly what you want, is to tell them. Like, it looks to me like if you did this or said this, then that would satisfy me. And then you might say, well, is that reasonable? Do you feel that it would be reasonable for you to offer that? Would you be willing to offer that? Am I pushing you too far? Those are all things that have to be sorted out. And then you can practice that, and you can practice that with the resolution of every dispute that emerges. If you're willing to take to yourself the responsibility of communicating to your partner your conditions for satisfaction, it means you have to admit them to yourself too, which is also very difficult. And then you can help your partner take stupid incremental steps forward, in the direction that you'd like to see expand, and then you can get better at that. And that's unbelievably useful. You can get better at how you have dinner together, or breakfast or lunch. Those things repeat every day, so they're very important. You can get better at how you greet each other when you come home. You can get better at the routine that you fall into, let's say, when you go to bed at night or when you wake up in the morning. All these things that repeat, because that's your life, the things that repeat. You can conceptualize how you might like them to be ordered if they were undertaken in an optimal manner, and you can start incrementally moving forward to that. And you can do that by communicating what you need and want, and by carefully rewarding your partner for taking the appropriate incremental steps forward. And so if you're trying to discipline yourself, you make a goal, you break it down into micro goals, and you implement the micro goals and reward yourself for doing so. And if you do that reliably and you make that a practice, that you'll become more disciplined across time. And you'll move towards the fulfillment of your goals. And that's practically how that's the practical guide for success on that front. And so I guess that's that. Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much, everyone. Very nice to see you all. And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. Yeah. Good night, everyone.
Mm-hmm.